Hello, everybody. My name is Paavo Ritala. I'm Professor of Strategy and Innovation at LUT University and incoming co-editor-in-chief in R&D Management. And I'm very proud to present the first session of ISPIM Methods in Focus series. It's good to see all of you here. And this is one of the first sessions that we're going to have on discussing about research methods and different aspects of those. And this initiative was born by a group of passionate people and excited people on research methods who are somehow connected to the ISPIM community. And there's actually a special interest group called ISPIM Breakthrough Methods and Skills. And we are hosting these discussions. Typically, there's a journal editor from our journal or from another technology and innovation management journal. And we are speaking with the authors or other people who are interested in methods and doing great work in the field of research methods, or applying methods in innovative and exciting ways. Today we have Ziad El-San. Hi, Ziad.
Hi, Paavo.
So Ziad is a senior lecturer in international business and director of education at the Entrepreneurship Innovation Strategy Department at Newcastle Business School, Northumbria University. I hope that's right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I guess so, yeah. He has published his research in R&D management, for instance, technology forecasting, social change, industrial marketing management, and many other journals. And his research focuses on internationalization, knowledge coordination, integration, and strategy making processes and practices. But we are today here because he wrote with his co-authors a great paper in last year's R&D management special issue on research methods. And the paper is called "Are Rigor and Transparency Enough? Review and Future Directions for Case Studies in Technology and Innovation Management." A link to the paper is actually in the chat if anybody wants to see the paper also. And at this point, I would also mention that please post any questions that you have to the chat during the session. And we will have a short Q&A where we will pick up some of the questions from the chat box in about 10 or 15 minutes. So if you have any questions, just post them on the chat and we'll return to those questions in the end. We'll try to tackle as many as you can. We can start actually. So maybe Ziad, you could introduce the paper shortly, but let's start by the question that what actually is a case study? Because that's what it's all about. How would you define a case study, and why do you think it has become so popular? This session has already over 100 participants. I think case study is something that many people are interested on and many people are applying, myself included. So what it is and why is it so popular?
Okay, thanks, Paavo. Thanks for having me. All right, so before discussing the paper, how it emerged and so on, let's start with the definition. I personally like Rebecca Piccari's and her colleagues' definition in their 2009 paper in Organization Research Methods, because it's broad enough to include different approaches to case studies, because we have to realize that there is not one way of doing case studies. So they define it as a research strategy that examines through the use of different data sources a phenomenon in its naturalistic settings or context, and this is important, with the purpose of confronting theory with the empirical world, right? So from that definition, we can understand that case studies are able to offer rich contextualized explanations of actors' actions and interactions over time. Okay, so these are the strengths of the case studies: rich contextualized explanation of actors' actions and interactions over time, which also emphasize temporality. I think case studies has been popular. So if you look at the classical studies, for example, in management and organization theory, most of them came from were based on case studies, you know, like in organizational sociology and so on. And then there was a time where there was quantitative approaches took over, and then obviously in the late 80s with publishing Eisenhardt's paper that started to, you know, like popularize and legitimize the case study again. So should I move on to the paper then?
Well, yeah, let's reflect on the case study phenomena a little bit before.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, I also, like you, I really like case studies, and I've observed, and this is backed by also evidence that case studies actually, and qualitative research at large, it's published a little less in the very top management journals, but on the other hand, it has very large impact on developing of theory. So many people say that the role of a case study is oftentimes, exploration of a phenomenon, and also the definition that you provided on a case study referred to, things that are new and hard to define. So do you think that's the main strength of a case study? It's to explore something new, to explain something, or what is the role, or are there multiple roles?
Definitely there are multiple roles. So I think one of the reasons why there is the belief, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more later on, the myth that case studies are only used for theory building is largely due to the impact of the Eisenhardt paper, which is a brilliant paper, very important in the development of the field, but because many of us rely on it, so we have this idea that case studies should be used only for theory building. And so even when scholars are actually using the case study to refine or extend existing theory, they often claim in the research methods section that they are theory building or exploring. And that's potentially could be either because they are following a certain template, or because maybe editors or reviewers are pushing them to, like claim this, that they are introducing a new theory. But yeah, definitely agree. It's been very influential. If you look at the recent editorial by Pratt and colleagues in ASQ, they actually say that even though the number of qual studies published in the top journals are much less, the representation in the awards, for example, in AMJ, is very high. So, yeah.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned AMJ, there was a recent study that focused only on case studies on AMJ, and objective of each of those case studies was theoretical generalization. So it was, to create something new out of the case study, which is theoretical. But obviously that aligns with the role and the aims of the journal, such as AMJ, which is to always to create new theory. So when you publish a case study, you're kind of expected to do that. But there are also other roles for case studies, right? So you can test theory, you can modify theory. Some people say that you can try to falsify theory, to show that, okay, there's instances that theory doesn't work. I think that's case study has unlimited opportunities actually to contribute to theory or theorizing, or to empirical applications in very different ways. I think many case studies also contribute to empirical applications and practical utility. What do you think? Because I think many case studies are also published for that reason in other journals.
Yeah, definitely, I agree. And I think this is part of a broader sort of obsession with theoretical newness or contribution. And I think we mentioned this in our article in the discussion section.
Yep.
And definitely, case studies can be used in very different ways. Not only to generate new theory, you can use it to extend theory and refine it through abduction, for example. And I'm sure we'll talk about this. It could be about, looking at alternative explanations. So one of the classics, for example, is Allison's study of the Cuban Missile Crisis and how they used the different models of decision making on the same case to see which one offers different theoretical explanations. So you can use the case study to discover puzzles, theoretical puzzles and tensions. There are different ways, as you said. Yeah, totally agree.
Yep. So you did a huge work actually in reviewing 31 technology and innovation management journals across 6 years, from 2013 to 2018. And this is actually what the paper does. And the link to the paper is in the chat. Go and check it out. Could you tell briefly, what motivated you to write this study, or to conduct also this huge review, and what are the key messages that you draw out from that?
Okay, so we started this paper in 2018. We were working on a project, another project, looking at innovation adoption by SMEs. And as we were reviewing the literature and looking at those papers that use the case study approach, we started noticing some patterns. So there was over-reliance on certain data collection methods, for example. There was lack of justification for certain methodological decision and so on. So we thought, okay, you know, there is something here worth looking at. Now, some of us with an international business background were familiar with the work of Rebecca Picari and colleagues, in which they would review case study research, articles based on case study in a certain discipline to identify methodological practices and so on, and look at and try to offer guidance. So we looked at the innovation literature. We didn't find something similar that offers an analysis of how researchers use case studies, so how it's performed and used by researchers. Now, the innovation management field is quite unique in that it's a multidisciplinary field. So besides those scholars who identify as innovation management researchers, we also have people from other disciplines who study innovation phenomena, from economics, strategy, and so on. And this is important because methodological practices, they emerged and are constructed within disciplinary contexts, as Picari and colleagues argue. And so in innovation management, it's possible that we have a diverse set of practices that people bring with them from those different disciplines. So here we asked ourselves a question: where do we go from here? There are two different directions that one can take. On the one hand, you've got a group of scholars who believe that this diversity in practices can actually hinder the accumulation of scholarly knowledge. And so from there, they aim to develop a set of common practices for researchers to follow, and through which we can evaluate the rigor of a certain paper that is using a qualitative approach. For example, an example of this is the Aguinas and Solarino paper in SMJ. They try to develop criteria for how to do interview-based qualitative research. Another excellent example is the paper by Goffin and colleagues in Journal of Product Innovation Management, and they developed a set of criteria called cassettes that authors can use to objectively assess the articles against 10 criteria. Now, both those approaches take a point of departure from a positivist view. So the underlying logic is a replication logic. So it's assumed that if we follow these guidelines, we will increase transparency and rigor, and therefore increase replicability. So that if you and I follow the same practices and look at the data, there is a very high chance that we will arrive to the same conclusion, okay? On the other hand, you've got another group of scholars, such as Pratt and colleagues in their ASQ editorial 2019, who say that, well, now you're conflating transparency with replication and pushing a one-size-fits-all approach for all qualitative researchers to follow, which is unhelpful, because then you would be evaluating researchers based on criteria which can be potentially inconsistent with their philosophical assumptions. So rigor, according to this approach, is not about replication. It's rather about how the authors are able to defend their methodological choices and whether they are consistent with their philosophical assumptions or not. So we took this position because we said, well, if we want to encourage pluralism, which we believe is something useful in innovation management, because it's a complex phenomena, so it requires having different perspectives. So rather than proposing a one-size-fits-all template, which we can use to evaluate the rigor of the articles, we should actually evaluate articles based on the extent to which their practices are consistent and suitable with their philosophical assumption. So the next point for us was to find the framework that we can use to categorize these different approaches. And we've used the Van de Veen and Pohl framework, which differentiate between process and various ontology. And we can discuss this if now is a good time. I mean, yeah, okay.
It's a good time. So you identified 3 categories of case studies, and you focused on the science philosophical assumptions behind those, and you ended up with these 3, and these are variance qualitative case study, weak process qualitative case study and strong process qualitative case study. Well, in the interest of time, we are not gonna go, in very great detail, but maybe you can say just a couple of sentences of each which you identified. So I guess the variance qualitative case study is the multiple case study which we are used to be seeing, and oftentimes, citing the Eisenhardtian type of qualitative case study, which aims at theory building, if I'm correct.
Yeah. So the variance approach is based on a substantial ontology, which see the world as consisting of things, and a variance epistemology, which attempts to look at and that's their aim. Their aim is to look at the antecedents and consequences of certain phenomena. So, for example, research that look at the antecedents and consequences of incremental versus radical innovation. So that's the variance theorizing, which we call variance theorizing. And then you've got the weak process, and this is not a derogatory, term. It's called weak process in the process philosophy literature, in the organization theory literature. And in this approach, you've got the aim is to explain change in entities, explains the process that explains the change in entities. So, for example, models that have stages, phases, cycles, and so on. And those are quite common in the innovation management literature. And then the strong process view is one that is based on a process ontology, which assumes that the world is constituted by process. It consists of flows, ongoing flow. And so it conceptualizes the phenomena of innovation as ongoing process. Examples of this are, for example, approaches that take actor network theory or process and practice perspectives when studying innovation. So those are the three approaches briefly, but it's important that I say here that when we were choosing this organizing framework, this is not the only way to categorize the different case approaches. So another approach, for example, is to differentiate between those who adopt an interpretive versus a positivist versus a critical realist perspective. Okay, so our approach here, we chose this one. So my point is that any act of categorization is inescapably reductionist. Okay, so we're not claiming that our framework is the only way of organizing these different approaches. We did choose it, however, for two reasons. First, philosophically, the distinction between variance and process, or entities and process, is very sound. The second thing is the nature of the innovation management field, in which it's also commonly accepted that we can think of innovation as a thing, as an outcome, and as a process. So it would be common in the literature that we find researchers either take this approach or that approach, and that will help us in identifying the practices that are consistent with this one or this one.
Yeah, I found your categorization actually really helpful, on top of the others that we've seen, from other authors. And it was fairly, revealing that how different assumptions people might hold. But on the other hand, I was interested and also surprised about your finding that most of the papers don't actually, really elaborate on which category they belong, or of course they don't need to belong into one of the categories. They can be somewhere in between, but oftentimes they don't justify these choices. So I got the sense that you are suggesting authors to, pay greater attention to methodology, perhaps not by writing, lengthier, methodology sections, but probably by making more informed choices. Is this correct?
Yeah, definitely. That's the key message. So the key message, I would say, are two things. First, that as editors, as readers, we should evaluate articles based on the extent to which their practices are consistent with their paradigmatic assumptions. And so at the same time, for authors, they need to be reflexive, and they need to consider which assumptions they are following, and then be consistent and transparent in their methodological practices and ensuring that these are consistent with them. As you said, Paavo, there was very surprising findings when we reviewed. Very little justification given to most of the methodological choices. And yeah, we will talk about this, I'm sure, later on. I'll give more detailed example. But for example, in the data analysis section, very little explanation on how researchers went from data to theory. very little explanation of why specific companies have been chosen, so the sampling decisions. Very little explanation even for why case studies are adopted in the first place, and why, and whether it's used actually for inductive or abductive or deductive and so on. So the purpose behind it was not justified. So lack of justification also makes it difficult for the reviewers and for the readers to understand what is this about, you know?
Yep, and I think, you know, part of the problem is that, you know, maybe it's maybe lack of concern about these issues, or maybe lack of methodological skills, or that's why we're here actually discussing about these issues to improve. All of us want to improve on those. So what I often see in qualitative case studies is that there are these ceremonial citations, you know. So you will see Goya et al. 2013, you will see Eisenhardt, you will see both on the same paper, then you'll see something else. And you know, those are just, you know, dropped within the sentences where people say that, okay, it's a case study, and you know, it explores a new phenomenon, and period. And then, you know, something is analyzed. So, you know, in quantitative research, there are, you know, perhaps more generalized rules, you know, it's easier to communicate. But when you come to the qualitative context, you know, you should pay a little bit more attention and be more clear about, you know, what you intend to do. And there's a big argument and big debate about, you know, what actually is inductive research, or what is the Eisenhardt method really. There's a paper called like this, by the way, I suggest everybody to read it. It's written by Eisenhardt. And so people are sometimes a bit sloppy in using case study related methodological references. So why do you think this is the case?
So the inductive and abductive, do you want to go there now?
Yeah, well, let's go.
Yeah. Okay. So I think part, as you said, it's a ceremonial use of references. So we've noticed, for example, that let's say an article is looking at something processual, okay? So a processual phenomenon. And then they would cite, for example, Eisenhardt. I mean, there is nothing in Eisenhardt that prevents it from citing, from looking at process, but you've got Anne Langley, who's got a very detailed sort of, you know, like strategies for studying process research. So there was sometimes what appears to be just a ceremonial citation, as you said, just to legitimize the use of research. Okay, so if we cite Eisenhardt, that's fine, you know, like we're okay. Why there is confusion about the inductive, the use of inductive and deductive and so on? I think there are several reasons here. First, the induction in Eisenhardt's original paper is not very clear, it's underspecified. So Eisenhardt say that it's useful to have clear questions, and that it's possible to have some a priori constructs. And at the same time, it's she recommends that we go to the field with no theory under consideration, but also realizes that it's impossible to achieve this clean slate. So it's not clear what is the role of prior theory in this process. There is a very good paper by Anderson and Krag in Industrial Marketing Management that discussed this. So because the meaning of induction is not clear in the Eisenhardt approach or underspecified, researchers stretch the concept in different ways. Some of them use a purely inductive approach. Others have some prior theory that can play a guiding role. And Eisenhardt actually realized this in her research article, the one that you referred to in 2021, and said that if she would be writing this article now, she would have a more theory building possibilities and would discuss abduction, for example. The second reason is that we need to distinguish between the philosophical discussion in the philosophy of science about induction, deduction, and abduction, and their limitations, etc., and between our practice of these reasoning modes. In philosophy, the discussion is normative. They're talking about the possibility of achieving universal principles that can characterize knowledge creation across fields of scientific inquiry. And this does not really give us guidance as empirical researchers, because philosophers don't have an agreement on what induction or abduction and deduction is really about, and whether they are possible or not. And they don't give those operational guidance to us. So in practice, there is a paper by Mantia and Ketogifi, I think, in AMR, that say basically that in practice, we actually use all three. Okay, so if you're an inductive researcher, you actually use deduction to spot the gap and, you know, like deduce a research question and so on. If you're abductive researcher in later stages, even in grounded theorizing, you have some deduction, abduction when you engage in axial and selective coding. So Anne Langley actually think that the idea of induction is you know, like overemphasized, and we actually, what we do is more of abduction rather than induction.
Yes, and maybe we should define these terms, by the way, if somebody's listening and doesn't, you know what induction, abduction, and deduction mean, right? So let's do it shortly. So induction is generalizing from empirics to the theory, right? So and deduction is applying a theoretical template to interpret empirics, and abduction is a mixture of these, right?
Yeah,
in a very crude sense.
Yeah.
So my kind of own suggestion or idea of how to do this as a researcher in a paper, and maybe you can comment what you think about it, is to actually, okay, so to cite those methodological references that you actually draw from in your philosophy or in your analysis, and also then, you know, just explain how you approach the analysis. It might have these inductive parts, it might have these deductive parts, it might have, you know, abductive parts, and you know, if we say that abduction includes both, you know, then all research is abduction. But if we describe carefully what we did in different phases, you know, there are elements of different approaches. Almost always there's a mixture, you know, so very seldom we follow a really strict template. And of course, if we follow a really strict template, we can tell that as well.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think to overcome this problem, rather than just referring, say, I'm doing induction or I'm adopting an inductive, explain actually, you know, like how the process unfolded. And often, Pavo, it's just about telling the story, really. One of the problems with how we write articles is that we write them after the fact. So we tend to engage in post-hoc rationalization of how the data analysis process unfolded. Okay, so make it appear as a very logical, linear process. Well, in reality, it's very messy. So it actually is better, from my perspective, to explain what you found and which codes were deductively developed from prior theory, which one developed or inductively developed from data, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. And the problem is, of course, that if you do all of this explanation, you know, the method section will be huge. So that brings us back to the templates. And you know, we had some discussion before this, and you mentioned that some templates become kind of boundary objects and or become, you know, tools in the toolbox of a qualitative case researcher. But some people are saying that we are now over relying on templates. There are now critical voices saying that, okay, on one hand, it's great to have templates like Goya type data structure, which is sometimes used just as a visualization, and then otherwise the methodology is different. Sometimes, you know, the Goya methodology is used in full. And there are some critics now who are saying that we are over relying on templates because now it forces us actually to do something that we might not want to do as qualitative researchers. We don't always inductively build the whole, you know, theory or the whole analysis from the bits and pieces, and they don't always neatly fall in place. Or should we force them to do so in you know, for the sake of transparency? Some people are starting to criticize this as well. If you maximize the transparency and traceability, you know, you then sacrifice some of the tools that qualitative researchers used to have in a hermeneutic circle sense. What do you think? You know, this is pretty philosophical, but I think it's important.
No, I think it's important. I think so. If we take the Goya example, the Goya example did us a huge service in terms of legitimizing qualitative research back then, but now it became also a restrictive device because most reviewers, not most, but a lot of reviewers would ask scholars to follow it. It happened to me. So that's a challenge, because not all approaches, not all research questions, not all data actually fits with the structure of the Goya methods. So if you are looking, for example, at like process questions, or sometimes you're taking a narrative or a discourse-based approach, that does not necessarily fits with the Goya methods. Even Eisenhardt actually was in one of the papers, in I think it was in Journal of Management Inquiry. She was saying that like she was asked to follow the Goya method. Like so it's quite limiting when your data does not fit this neat data structure. It does not always work this way, especially if you're following a more of a narrative approach to presenting your findings. So I would say that we need to be aware that there are different approaches of doing qualitative research, okay? And not every data analysis template can actually be relevant. So we need to think of whether this template is consistent with the research question and the philosophical assumptions of the scholars or not, and not impose a template on them. And think of those templates just as tools. Use them when they are suitable, otherwise don't.
Yeah. And it's a really difficult choice, because when you get reviewer comments like the ones you mentioned, you need to be able to defend your choice that, okay, well, I'm not using a template here because I did the analysis like this, and then people still will ask traceability and so on. So it's I think it's going to be an ongoing discussion, and it's going to be really interesting to see how it turns out. As reviewers and editors, authors ourselves, we can make choices of what we also demand from each other. Sometimes I guess sometimes the right answer is to use a template. If you're doing research that actually is the style that fits with using that kind of template. Or by template I mean any toolbox, any approach that has predetermined features. In a sense, the three-tier typology in your paper, it's a sort of a template as well, right? From where you can choose, and then you can follow your guidance. Of course, you are not putting a very strict template, but you're still providing guidance towards a certain direction. If somebody chooses to let's say to do a strong process qualitative study, you're providing suggestions how to do that.
Yeah, but we're very careful. I think we've mentioned in the discussion that this is not, don't take this as a template, it's a toolbox. Okay, so draw on it reflectively. And I think that's the key point. There is also a good thing here that there are many people who are actually speaking about this now. So if you get, like the reviewer who would push you to adopt a certain approach that does not necessarily fit with what you're doing, you can, like cite Eisenhardt, you can cite Joab, the papers in the Journal of Management Studies that actually criticize this. So there are lots of other ways now to legitimize not using those templates. And I think this is possibly can be a way to go forward.
Yeah. I think the discussion will go on. So we will need some sort of accumulation in how we understand methods, and citing certain sources is helpful. Certain templates are helpful, but on the other hand, as qualitative researchers, we have to constantly think that what is unique, and we have to face it. Oftentimes the analysis style that we do is unique to the particular analysis, particular case also. So it's going to be an ongoing tension. So we're going to move now to the questions. The template of ISPIM methods in focus is around 30 minutes of discussion, and then 10 to 15 minutes for questions. And we have received over 20 comments in the chat box, and I'm going to single out a few of those here, which we are going to discuss. And after about some 10 minutes, we're going to stop. And some of the questions won't be replied here. I already have to apologize. If you want, you can follow up in email to myself or Ziad, or if you send email to myself, I can always link you with Ziad as well if you cannot find our contact info. So feel free to follow up via email. This is a nice discussion if we can continue it also after the session. But okay, let's jump to the first question, and it was also something that I would have asked if we have had time. So I'm going to combine these two things here. So,
okay.
so single case studies and cross case studies, multiple case studies, I mean. And we have a question from Päivi Aaltonen, who happens also to be from LUT University, Finland, is asking that, how do you feel about the argument of a case study by Eisenhardt and Yin that a case study should have at least 4 to 7 cases? And as far as I remember, the old rule was that 4 to 10, right? You know, in the 89 article. But you know, this thing, and more broadly, how do you feel about single case studies and multiple case studies? What are the roles for each, and what are the key differences? And you know, and then we can elaborate about the number of cases and whether that matters.
Okay, so I think in terms of the it's not an easy distinction. Okay, so the multiple case studies, the Eisenhardt approach recommends the multiple case study because of its ability to detect similarities and differences across different contexts. And this, according to Eisenhardt, this would allow theoretical generalization or analytical generalization, as Yin called it. I agree. I think that having multiple cases allows you to capture this, you know, like move beyond the idiosyncrasies of single cases and start detecting similarities and differences and the explanation behind those similarities and differences across different cases. So that's
and you can always say that, you know, it's not then only a unique instance, you know.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, starting from 2 cases and upwards, you can say that, you know, this is not a one instance, but it's, you know, something is repeated. So you start to engage into those discussions.
Yeah, and this is can be specifically useful for variance related questions because it helps you in identifying, you know, like those complexities. Another thing that is specific to innovation management research, Gary et al. In their and colleagues in their review of innovation, perspective on innovation in Academy of Management Annals, they talk about different complexities that characterize innovation phenomena. Okay, one of them is cultural complexity. So the idea that innovation can unfold differently depending on different cultural context and different contextualized spaces. Multiple case studies would be very good at detecting this or addressing this complexity, because you can then compare how this happens across different contexts. That does not diminish the value of single case studies. Single case studies are very important also in terms of, for example, strong process research, because it allows you to immerse yourself in the field. Okay, and by the way, there is also a possibility to have a single embedded case study. Okay, so you can, within the same single case study, have, for example, either multiple units of analysis. So you can, for example, look at an organization and then examine different innovations within the same organization. So then you have a single embedded case study, and this will allow you to detect also variance or similarities and differences among the different processes. The paper by Siegel-Cow on the, you know, like the talking pig and persuasion in case studies is really important, I think, in terms of understanding, you know, like when you can use single case studies. One thing, however, Paavo, that we've observed is that often when scholars use single case studies, they don't really provide a strong justification for what is unique about this case. Okay, so you have to either say what is unique about this case, or why this case, even if it's not, you know, like a popular context or anything, it could be revelatory for the theory that you're trying to develop.
Yeah, I agree. And some people actually use, in a quite clever way, a single case study to illustrate a theory that somebody else developed, or they actually developed themselves in the paper, without you know, starting to compare and contrast, you know, how broad-based that is. But you know, even with a single case study, still, you know, if they've developed a theory and then illustrated it with a single case study, then they can, you know, create assumptions that, you know, this might generalize well, you know, more broadly, just because they were able to illustrate it. But it's of course not as strong. But I think it's not as simple as some people say, that, you know, there are big differences. And by the way, also Hien Dao from Australia asked about how do you decide between a single case study and multiple case studies? So maybe you can respond to this as well. So Ziad, how would you decide whether to do a single case study or multiple case study?
Okay.
How do you do this decision? You know, which type of study for you is a single case study?
So I'll give an example. I, for example, was looking at internationalization decision at some point in my PhD. Okay. So a single case study could be useful if I'm able to observe this internationalization decision from the beginning until the end. Okay. So that would give me a very in-depth understanding of what happens. I can follow it in time. Okay. However, this is not always possible because companies announce their internationalization decision after the fact. Okay. So I cannot observe it often in real time. So that means that I will have to study it retrospectively. And so it will not be as rich. And in that case, for example, then it's better to have multiple case studies so that I avoid the idiosyncrasy of the single case, and then have multiple case studies where I can look at the similarities and differences in the decision-making process and detect those patterns. So it needs some reflexivity between three things: between the research question, the context, and the phenomena, the peculiarities of the phenomena that you're studying, and the philosophical assumptions. If you look, for example, at open innovation, for example, okay, so open innovation will likely involve multiple sites. So you need to ask yourself, is it better that I have multiple cases of multiple sites, or is it better to have a single site where I can observe multiple organizations working together, for example?
Yeah.
Sorry, go.
Yeah, these choices, I think they all relate a lot to the generalizability and how much you can generalize from those findings, or how comparative those are, because you are trying to find this somehow comparison or contrast between the cases and the observations that you make from those cases. I think there are two things about this. Another choice to make is whether to do a longitudinal or a process study versus a cross-sectional study. And some authors say that the generalizability of the case study rises when you get more cases, and also when your cases are longitudinal or processual, because many things that, especially if you think about the innovation management context, innovation, you have idea, you have innovation, you have commercialization, many of the phenomena that we study are actually very processual, and if you look at those in a cross-sectional case context, in a snapshot, even if you do a retrospective rationalizing based on your interviews, still a process would be better. So I think these are the two core choices, the number of cases and whether the data collection as well as the analysis is processual. And I think you just added the dimension here is also to address different perspectives from different actors. Many things that we study are systems oriented, there are networks, there are alliances, there are collaborations, there are very seldom only the key informant in an organization who knows everything about everything. So I think these three dimensions are, you can kind of get more rigorous and rich in each of these dimensions, and as you to try to improve the reach and generalizability. But I think there are trade-offs as well. Trade-offs, like if we wanted to focus in a really rich data collection, let's say a network of 50 or 100 members, it's kind of implausible to then collect a multiple case of multiple whole networks and so on. So there are also practical boundaries, and also I'm not sure what type of analysis would that be.
Yeah. So I totally agree. There are practical boundaries, not only in terms of Pettigrew would call it data acidification or something like that. Like you'd be, like paralyzed by the data. You won't be able to, like make sense of it. But there are also access issues. So if you want to observe these things, you're not going to get access that easily. Another thing is institutional, Pavel. So it's not only methodological. Many people are on tenure, okay, and they need to get published to get tenured, and so they need to get published, right? And longitudinal studies would take them years to, like a longitudinal project would take them actually years to publish. And so there is also this side of the conversation that needs to be happening. You know, like we keep on calling for longitudinal research, but our institutional clocks are not actually consistent with these calls for longitudinal research. So there's several factors at play, and even the journal format. So longitudinal research requires that you immerse yourself in the field and provide a rich narrative of what happened. But the format of the journal article is not very helpful in this, okay? And so you often have two choices to make. You either have to abstract from this richness, okay? And so you lose the benefits of this sort of in-depth, you know, like understanding that is actually the strength of it. Or you would have to have multiple cases to sort of, you know, like be able to detect those allies and heart methods, detect those patterns, and so on. One solution, I think, maybe you as an editor can tell us whether it's possible or not, is to use more of the online appendices. To add, for example, the complete narrative of the case in an appendix, and so on.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And actually, we had a question from Luis Irgang about how to develop rich case studies, providing reasonable level of detail about cases and contexts when journals are demanding shorter papers. But I think you just addressed that. So, and this is what many journals actually nowadays suggest, that, you know, if you have this additional material, you know, add it as an online appendix, or at least, you know, as an you know, material for review for reviewers to address, you know. But of course, you know, it would be great to have those resources for the upcoming readers, those who are interested in reading those longer descriptions. So I would say, just in a practice, you can also embed a web link to a online resource for the readers, even if the journal wouldn't have this supplementary online material format. Of course, it's better that they do, because then it's kind of, you know, more organized. But many authors are, for instance, nowadays in experimental studies and in quant studies, you know, providing data sets or providing methodological tools or toolkits in an online repository of their own somewhere. But there are different ways, and I think there's always a way. So it's not a good excuse to say that, you know, we're out of space, you know, we cannot do it. Sometimes it is an actual reason, but I think it's increasingly less so. Journals are starting to take this into account. I think it's time to stop here. Actually, we don't want to go overboard. For everybody, if you enjoyed this and if you want to revisit this will be available in a video later on. You have the link in the chat box, and there's also going to be a podcast. I hope our discussion also makes sense without the video, but we didn't share anything in the screen, so it should. So I want to thank you, Ziad, very much for this.